Many people think of global warming and climate change as synonyms, when, in fact, they are not. Scientists prefer to use climate change when describing the complex shifts that affect the Earth's weather and climate systems. Climate change encompasses Earth's rising average temperatures, changes in precipitation patterns, extreme weather events such as droughts, wildfires, and floods, shifting wildlife populations and habitats, rising sea levels, and a range of many other impacts.
The difference between weather and climate is basically scale. So weather occurs at the scale of hours to days, and it's the current conditions. Whereas climate is temperature and precipitation and humidity and wind averaged over years and decades. So it's a very different way of looking at those weather conditions because climate is the average and the extremes, and it's what you expect to occur based on a large amount of weather data, whereas weather is what's happening outside at the moment.
Saskatchewan has a naturally variable semi-arid climate, characterized by short, hot summers, long, cold winters, and low annual precipitation. Climate model projections for the Canadian Prairies show warming temperatures, changes in precipitation patterns, increased evapotranspiration during the summer months, and an increase in frequency and magnitude of extreme events. Differences in the future climate of Saskatchewan will be further emphasized by the natural variability that we have. Understanding Saskatchewan's climate will help communities build resiliency to climatic change.
We can build resiliency in our extremely variable climate by understanding the climate and by anticipating changes in the amount of variability, because the climate science indicates that even though we have an extremely variable climate, it could be even more variable as a result of climate change. And so you have to understand where the risks exist. You have to understand, depending on what you do for a living, where you are exposed to certain risks, and you have to understand where you're vulnerable.
Agriculture producers should have greater crop and pasture productivity, but they will need to adapt to future climate change and extreme events in order to achieve positive production results. Climate change adaptation includes planning, acting, observing, and learning, and adjusting actions as needed before starting the cycle again. Saskatchewan agricultural producers have already been doing this.
Ag producers are experts at adaptation. If they hadn't adapted to our dry, cold climate, we wouldn't have an agricultural economy. So if you look at the history of agriculture over the last 140 years, there's been a tremendous amount of adaptation to sustain agriculture and make it commercially viable. But further adaptation is required as the climate changes and as we anticipate wetter, warmer winters and drier summers.
Well, farmers are resilient and they always find a way to get through something, right? Like, I know growing up on my farm, we went through the droughts of '88. I wasn't very old then, I was 13, but they still stick with me because I know what the family dynamics were going around. I knew there was farmers that were getting foreclosed on. Fortunately, we were close enough to a river. How we did it with the grandfather isn't exactly what we use for tools now. It's a stepping stone. But as you get higher up on the flight of stairs, you learn from what previous mistakes are, right? And so what we found is, back in the day, the cultivator shovel, the steel was the way to work your land and control your weeds, and it was the only way to go. But I don't know if you remember in the middle of the 80s, when there was a big windstorm that came up, you couldn't see anywhere because there was dust blowing everywhere, right? And that wasn't even the dust bowl of the 30s. So now what we're doing is we are, with the regenerative ag, and the knowledge that we learned from previous mistakes, we're keeping the soil covered.
Sharing beneficial management practices, or BMPs, that can be adopted by agricultural producers and rural communities to build resiliency to climate change impacts and effects is important. Being able to share on-the-ground experiences and observations, like those on Aaron Gray's operation, help us see the many benefits implementing BMPs can provide.
I started implementing regenerative agriculture on my farm is because I seen the benefits that it can have on my farm, and it can cut the costs of my added synthetic fertilizers by the use of a cow. I use the cows for my fertility, and honestly, I don't think it can be done as well if you don't have a herd of cows helping you out. It speeds the process up. It allows the manure to be spread evenly across the field, and it keeps the percentage of organic matter back in the field. So 20% goes to the cow, 80% goes back to the soil. And I found as I keep grazing and winter feeding out on the fields, I'm using less and less synthetic fertilizers, and I'm needing less and less moisture to grow the same amount of tons. So most recently I've done rotational grazing, and this year it's been a year of very, very low rainfall. And what I've noticed this year in particular is where I've had 6 or 7 day rotations on certain paddocks, and then the cows have been moved off, and I find that it eats everything right down, and then all of a sudden it's completely rested. It's not getting pounded by hooves. It's not getting pounded by clipping off all the good areas. And so now middle of May was the last time some of the paddocks were touched, and we've got, even through the drought, we had nice regrowth like this. And now we've had some significant rainfall, and the cows are about to move back out to those paddocks and do another quick grazing over top of it, and we'll still have lots of moisture and lots of time to have a nice permanent cover come snowfall, which will then help with runoff, because you'll have lots of growth there that's going to create insulation, that's going to create a slow melt, and a lot of roots that's going to take the moisture in. So this year particularly, I've noticed quite a bit of a difference that way. A couple other BMPs I've done is I've been using the riparian area. What I found is those areas are pretty fragile soils because you have your evaporative rings of your water bodies, and so I've either fenced off some of the areas that I know have been issues that I don't want to have a bunch of cattle in there, but I've also been seeding down some riparian areas and putting a permanent cover in there. And some of the vegetative growth that I've had there has been very beneficial, especially on a year like this. It's a lot drier. You can then, if the ground's not muddy and stuff like that, you can run your cows in there, do a nice graze off of it, bring them out, then you have good, healthy regrowth on the riparian areas. So, and then you use them when you need them, and you leave them alone when you don't need them. Last year in particular, I took advantage of a BMP with saw. I did a cover crop. And I did quite a few acres of cover crop because we were so wet in the springtime. There were certain areas that I couldn't seed, and so then I had mud spots and bare tilled soil and stuff like that had manure spread on from the cattle. So I figured, well, I got to do something here. So I seeded oats and peas into it in the beginning of August when we could get the land, nice enough that we could get onto it, and we had a heck of a crop of oats and peas there going into the fall. This year in particular, where I noticed when I seeded through the whole field, where I went through where the cover crop was versus where I had crop last year, there was a defined line, exactly where the line was for the cover crop. Maybe it had a little more moisture retention, but I also think it had a little bit more stable soil and more fertile soil because of it.
With future expected changes in precipitation, temperatures, and extreme events, agricultural producers' ability to adapt will be imperative. Education and information about climate change adaptation becomes an important part of the process. Education that is based on real research.
There's now a wealth of information on climate change, adaptation, and resiliency online. The federal government has created a program called the Canadian Centres for Climate Services, and the regional hub is called Climate West, and so I advise people to visit the Climate West website for information on climate change. And then there are the research centers that are doing work on how our climate is changing. And the research center that I direct, PARC, has a website at www.parc.ca. And I recommend that you visit our data application pages because we are posting information on how we are helping Indigenous communities, municipalities, and governments and industry adapt to climate change.